The water below Lieutenant Royce Williams was cold enough to kill him in about 10 minutes. That is not a figure of speech. That is the arithmetic of the Sea of Japan in November. Air temperature in the 20s degrees Fahrenheit. Water temperature in the mid-30s. A man who went into that sea, even in the rubberized exposure suit the pilots called a poopy suit, had minutes before the cold took his hands, then his breathing, then his heart. And nobody was going to find him anyway, because a Siberian blizzard had come down across the water and swallowed the entire American fleet. The cloud base was down around 500 feet. Visibility was 2 miles in blowing snow. The carrier he had launched from was pitching so hard that her stern was swinging through a 20-foot arc. He was 400 feet above that water, in a fighter aircraft with no hydraulics, no rudder, no flaps, and no ammunition. He had one working flight control, the elevators, which moved the nose up and down. That was all. Everything else was gone. Behind him, still shooting, was a Soviet MiG-15. It was November 18, 1952. Williams was 27 years old and had never fired his guns at another aircraft in his life before that afternoon. In the previous half hour, he had done something that no American naval aviator had done before, and none has done since. 3 weeks later, an admiral would close a door in Yokosuka, Japan, sit him down, and tell him he could never say who he had been fighting. Not to the press, not to his squadron, not to his commanding officer, not to his wife. He kept that promise for 50 years. One quick thing before I go on. This channel lives or dies on whether people find it, and the way people find it is you. So if you want more history that goes to the archives, rather than to the legend, subscribe, say something in the comments, send this to somebody. That is the whole ask. Back to the storm. I want to start by telling you what the secret actually was, because almost everyone gets this wrong, including a lot of people who tell this story well. The secret was not that there had been a dogfight. That may surprise you, but the fight itself was reported. There were intelligence summaries about it. In 1953, a reasonably accurate account of the engagement appeared in a men's adventure magazine written by the commanding officer of Williams's own squadron. Sailors on the Oriskany saw the aircraft come back shot to pieces. There was no cover story, no denial, and no pretense that nothing had happened. Every one of those accounts said the same thing. American Panthers had fought enemy MiGs. Enemy. That was the word. Just enemy. And that single word is the whole secret, because the aircraft Royce Williams fought that afternoon were not North Korean. They were not Chinese. They did not carry the borrowed markings that Soviet pilots used over the Yalu River. They were Soviet Air Defense Force fighters. They launched from an airfield inside the Soviet Union. They were directed by a Soviet ground controller. Their orders came from Soviet officers, and those orders were to attack United States Navy aircraft. And they died. At least 3 of them, and probably 4, and possibly 5. That is what was classified for half a century. Not the battle, the identity of the men in the other aircraft, and the number of them who went into the sea. Because if the United States admitted out loud, in November 1952, that an American pilot had just killed 4 Soviet military aviators in an air battle over international water, then the shadow war that both superpowers had spent 2 years carefully pretending not to fight would suddenly be a real one, with a real name, on the front page of every newspaper on Earth. And there was a very specific reason that was unthinkable in exactly that month, which we will come to. To understand how it happened, and why it had to be buried, we have to go back 2 years, to the morning the United States Navy discovered that its best fighter aircraft was obsolete. In the first months of the Korean War, the air belonged entirely to the Americans. North Korea flew propeller aircraft, Yak fighters, and ground attack machines, and they were swept out of the sky almost immediately. The Navy's new jet, the Grumman F9F Panther, shot down 2 Yaks on its first combat mission in July 1950. American pilots flew where they liked, when they liked. The air war looked finished before it started. Then, on November 1, 1950, a formation of American Mustangs near the Yalu River was jumped by something nobody in the United States military had ever seen in combat. It was swept wing. It climbed like nothing they had. It was faster than anything the United Nations had in theater, and it came from across the Chinese border, from an airfield at Antung, and it went home across that border, where American pilots were forbidden to follow. It was the Mikoyan Gurevich MiG-15, and the Soviet Union had just quietly moved an entire regiment of them into Manchuria. I want to give you the numbers, because the numbers are the whole story, and I want you to do the subtraction yourself, rather than take my word for it. The Grumman F9F Panther, the version Royce Williams would be flying 2 years later, one turbojet engine, roughly 6,250 pounds of thrust, top speed around 600 miles per hour at sea level, and it bleeds off badly with altitude. Service ceiling around 42,800 feet, rate of climb around 5,000 feet per minute, straight wings, 420mm cannon in the nose, 760 rounds total. The MiG-15, one turbojet engine, roughly 6,000 pounds of thrust, hung in a considerably lighter airframe, top speed around 668 miles per hour at sea level, and it holds that speed as it climbs, where the Panther cannot. Service ceiling around 50,900 feet, rate of climb around 10,000 feet per minute, swept wings, angled at 35 degrees, one 37mm cannon and two 23mm cannon. Read those again. The MiG climbed twice as fast. It flew 8,000 feet higher. It was roughly 100 knots faster, which in air combat is not an advantage. It is a permission slip. A faster aircraft chooses whether to fight. A slower one does not. The MiG pilot could enter combat whenever he wanted, leave whenever he wanted, and come back whenever he wanted, and there was nothing the Panther pilot could do about any of it. And the guns were not comparable. The Panther fired 20mm shells. The MiG carried a 37mm cannon, and a 37mm shell does not damage an aircraft. It removes a piece of one. Against all of that, the Panther had exactly three things. It had an excellent gun sight, better than the Soviet one. Its 4 cannon fired fast and reliably, and down low, at lower speeds, it could turn a tighter circle than a MiG. That was the entire hand. 3 small cards against a stacked deck. And now I have to tell you where the MiG's engine came from, because if you do not already know this, you are not going to believe it, and if you do already know it, you will understand why I cannot leave it out. In 1946, the war was over. The alliance that won it was still technically intact, and the Soviet Union had a problem. Soviet jet engines were bad. Moscow had copied captured German designs, and the German designs had been built in wartime with the wrong metals by a country running out of everything, and they burned out fast. Soviet engineers knew exactly what they needed. They needed a British engine, the Rolls-Royce Nene, a centrifugal turbojet that was, at that moment, one of the most powerful and reliable jet engines on Earth. Stalin was reportedly told that his engineers wanted to go and ask the British for it. The remark attributed to him has become famous. What fool, he is said to have asked, will sell us his secrets? The answer, astonishingly, was the British government. In 1946, the Soviet engine designer Vladimir Klimov travelled to Britain. The new Labour government of Clement Attlee, keen to improve relations with Moscow, with a trade minister named Stafford Cripps who seems not to have understood at all what was coming, authorised the sale. Dozens of Rolls-Royce Nene engines were shipped to the Soviet Union across 1946 and 1947. Soviet engineers came to the Rolls-Royce works at Derby and were trained on how to maintain and repair them. The sale carried one condition. The engines were not to be used for military purposes. The Soviets took the engines home, tore them down, and copied them. The copy was designated the RD-45. An improved and enlarged version followed, and it was named after the man who had gone to Britain to ask. It was called the VK-1, for Vladimir Klimov. The VK-1 is the engine in the MiG-15. Rolls-Royce later attempted to claim license fees from the Soviet Union, reportedly to the tune of £207 million. They received nothing. And here is the part that turns an embarrassing story into an almost unbelievable one. Pratt & Whitney also licensed the Nene, legally, properly, with a contract, at the request of the United States Navy. They built it in America and designated it the J-42. The J-42 is the engine in the Grumman Panther. So on the afternoon of November 18, 1952, over the Sea of Japan, Lieutenant Royce Williams and the pilots of the 781st Fighter Aviation Regiment tried to kill each other using aircraft powered by two descendants of the same British engine. One bought under license, one stolen. The men in those cockpits were flying, in a very real sense, the same machine, wrapped in two different airframes, and the airframes were what decided who lived. Because that is the honest answer to why the MiG was better. It was not a better engine. It was roughly the same engine, in a lighter aircraft, with swept wings, and swept wings were the future, and Grumman had built the Panther with straight ones. The Panther was a beautifully made, superbly engineered, thoroughly conventional aircraft that arrived about 18 months too late to be current, and the men who flew it knew it. There is one more piece of evidence for that, and it is the coldest one available, because it is not an opinion, it is a scoreboard. During the Korean War, a number of United States Navy and Marine Corps aviators flew on exchange duty with the Air Force. Among them were two men who would later go into space, John Glenn and Wally Schirra. Also among them was a Marine major named John Bolt. Bolt shot down 6 MiG-15s. He became the only jet ace in the history of naval aviation in that war. He did it flying an Air Force F-86 Sabre. Naval aviators, it turns out, could kill MiGs perfectly well. They just could not do it in Navy aircraft. Put a Navy pilot in a swept-wing Sabre, and he became an ace. Leave him in a Panther, and the Navy's entire 3-year total against the MiG-15 was 7 aircraft. That is the institutional truth Royce Williams was flying inside of. It was not that American pilots were outmatched, it was that American carrier aircraft were. And to underline just how strange the arithmetic had become, consider Captain Jesse Folmar, a Marine, who in September 1952 shot down a MiG-15 while flying an F-4U Corsair. A Corsair is a propeller aircraft. It is a World War II fighter. A Marine in a piston-engine airplane from the last war managed to kill a swept-wing jet, which tells you two things at once. It tells you the MiG was not invincible. And it tells you that by 1952, the Navy's air-to-air record against it had become so thin that a propeller kill was one of the highlights. Now, the first American to claim a MiG was an Air Force pilot, First Lieutenant Russell Brown, flying an F-80 Shooting Star on November 8, 1950. He reported a kill after a diving fight near the Yalu, and his claim went into the official history of the United States Air Force as the first jet-versus-jet victory in the history of warfare. It is still there. It is almost certainly wrong. When Russian records were finally opened after the Cold War, historians found the Soviet pilot Brown had fired at. He was a senior lieutenant named Kharitonov, and he had landed his MiG safely at Antung. Brown had gotten close enough to shoot only because Kharitonov never saw him coming. Had the Soviet pilot noticed him and simply advanced his throttle, the MiG would have left the shooting star behind, as if it were standing still. The real first jet-versus-jet kill in history happened the next day, and it belonged to the Navy, and it happened in a Panther. On November 9, 1950, Lieutenant Commander William Amen, the commanding officer of Fighter Squadron 111, the Sundowners, was leading Panthers off the carrier Philippine Sea, covering an attack on the bridges at Sinuiju, right on the Yalu River. MiGs came up from Antung, just across the water, to defend them. The Soviet pilot who led them in was a captain named Mikhail Grachev. What happened next tells you precisely how a Panther could beat a MiG, and precisely why it almost never did. Grachev came at the American formation, and our men turned into him, head-on. Grachev then pulled his nose up and climbed, hard, straight up from around 4,000 feet to 15,000, because that is what a MiG pilot does. That is his advantage. He can go up and the American cannot follow. Amen followed anyway. He half-looped, and at the top of the climb, Grachev did the one thing he could not afford to do. He yawed his aircraft, swinging his nose side to side, looking for the Panthers he had lost sight of. That cost him seconds, and it cost him energy. Amen cut inside him and came down onto his tail. Amen fired. He hit. Grachev rolled into a vertical dive, straight down, and the Panther went after him. And here is where the aircraft itself nearly killed the man flying it. As the Panther accelerated in the dive, it approached its terminal velocity and began to buffet, shuddering, controls going stiff and reversing on him, an aircraft telling its pilot, in the clearest possible language, that it was not built for this. Amen fought it, held the nose on target, and put more 20mm into the MiG as it crossed his sight. Both aircraft pulled out at around 3,000 feet. Amen recovered his Panther somewhere near 200 feet above the ground. His wingman watched Grachev's MiG go into a hillside and explode. That is the first jet-on-jet kill in the history of air combat. And notice what it required. It required a Soviet pilot to make a mistake. It required an American pilot of exceptional skill to exploit it instantly. And it required that American to fly his aircraft past the edge of its design envelope, in a dive that could have torn it apart, to a recovery 200 feet above a Korean mountain. That is what it took to kill one MiG with a Panther. Now consider the scoreboard for the entire war. Across 3 years of fighting, Panther pilots claimed a grand total of 7 MiG-15s. 7. In 3 years. And the Navy learned the lesson quickly. And the lesson was humiliating. As 1951 arrived and the MiG numbers grew, the Panther was quietly moved out of the air superiority business. It became a ground attack aircraft. It carried bombs and rockets against North Korean bridges, trains, and anti-aircraft positions, and it took its losses from flak, and the job of fighting MiGs was handed to the United States Air Force, which had the one aircraft in the American inventory that could meet a MiG-15 on level terms. That aircraft was the F-86 Sabre. It had swept wings. It was the answer. And there were no Sabres on aircraft carriers. So the Navy went to war for 3 years, knowing something that it did not advertise. If Soviet-built swept-wing fighters ever came at the fleet in numbers, the fleet's own fighters could not stop them. The Panther was a fine aircraft in 1949. By 1952, it was a museum piece with a paint job, and every pilot in Task Force 77 understood that. Royce Williams understood it. He was born on April 4, 1925, in Wilmot, South Dakota, and he grew up there and in Clinton, Minnesota. His father was a grocer who had served in the First World War. He was an Eagle Scout. Before he was old enough to do anything else about the war he could see coming, he served as a corporal in the Minnesota State Guard, and after Pearl Harbor, he enlisted in the Navy as an aviation cadet. He was too late for the war he had joined to fight. He earned his wings at Pensacola in August 1945, the same month Japan surrendered. So he did what a young naval aviator did in a world that had abruptly stopped needing him. He flew Hellcats and Corsairs. He hunted submarines that were no longer out there. He served aboard the carriers Franklin D. Roosevelt and Princeton. He went back to school and took a degree at the University of Minnesota and then a master's degree at the Naval Postgraduate School at Monterey. By the time he joined Fighter Squadron 781 and went to Korea aboard the Oriskany, he was 27 years old, extremely well trained, extremely well educated, and completely untested. He had roughly 70 combat missions in his logbook by November 1952, and every single one of them was ground attack. Bombs and rockets against North Korean bridges and trucks and gun positions. He had never been in an air-to-air fight in his life. Nobody in his squadron expected that he ever would be. That was not the Panther's job anymore, and everybody knew it. Which raises an obvious question. If the Panther could not fight MiGs, and the Navy knew the Panther could not fight MiGs, why was Royce Williams sent up into a blizzard to intercept them? The answer is that the alternative was worse. The American fleet's air search radar could reliably detect aircraft out to about 100 miles, and no further. Soviet Il-28 jet bombers had been photographed at airfields in the region, and an Il-28 could cover 100 miles in a matter of minutes, which meant that if Soviet bombers ever came for Task Force 77, the fleet would see them appear on the scope and then have almost no time at all to do anything about it. A combat air patrol is not a plan to win, it is a plan to buy minutes. You put fighters up between the threat and the fleet, and you accept that they may be outclassed, and you accept that they may die, because even an outclassed fighter forces an incoming strike to slow down, break formation, and deal with it. Every second the interceptors buy is a second the carriers have to turn into the wind and launch everything they have. Royce Williams was launched that afternoon as a tripwire. Nobody sent him up there expecting him to win. Which brings us to the other side of this story, and to the thing that makes the Sea of Japan different from every other patch of sky in the Korean War. The Soviet pilots flying over North Korea operated under a set of rules so restrictive they are almost comic. Their aircraft wore Chinese or North Korean markings. They were issued Chinese uniforms. They were told not to speak Russian on the radio, and given phrase cards in Korean instead, an instruction that survived about as long as the first serious dogfight, at which point men fighting for their lives at 500 miles an hour reverted to their mother tongue and screamed at each other in Russian while American pilots listened. But the two rules that mattered most were these: do not fly over the front line, and do not fly over the sea. The reasoning was simple. A Soviet pilot shot down over friendly territory could be recovered quietly. A Soviet pilot shot down over the ocean or over United Nations lines might be fished out by an American ship or captured by American soldiers, and then paraded in front of the world's cameras, and then the fiction would be over and the two superpowers would be publicly at war. So the Soviets kept to their corridor along the Yalu, and the Americans kept out of Manchuria, and both governments told their citizens that nothing was happening. Nearly 72,000 Soviet personnel served in the Korean theater. Soviet pilots flew roughly 64,000 combat sorties and fought in more than 1,800 air battles, losing over 300 aircraft and more than 120 pilots, and none of it, according to Washington and Moscow, was occurring. But that arrangement applied to the war in Korea. It did not apply to the Soviet Union, because there was a second Soviet Air Force, and it followed entirely different rules. It was the Air Defense Force, the men whose job was not to intervene in somebody else's war, but to guard Soviet soil. And in 1950, Moscow gave that force a new policy, and the policy was severe. Anything that came near the borders of the Soviet Union was to be attacked. Not warned, not escorted away, attacked. Here is what that meant in practice, and I want to lay these out one by one, because they are the reason Royce Williams should have died. On November 6, 1951, a United States Navy Neptune patrol aircraft was flying over the Sea of Japan near Vladivostok. Soviet fighters intercepted it, shot it down, and it fell burning into the water. 10 Americans were aboard. 3 days of searching found no trace of any of them. The Navy declared the entire crew dead the following year. On June 13, 1952, an Air Force reconnaissance aircraft was shot down over the Sea of Japan by Soviet MiG-15s near the Soviet coast. On October 7, 1952, 6 weeks before our story, another American reconnaissance aircraft was shot down by Soviet fighters over the Kuril Islands. A Japanese fisherman later told an American investigator that he had watched a Russian fighter dive out of the sky and shoot the tail section clean off the aircraft. 8 men were aboard. Search efforts found nobody. That is the pattern. That is the record of what happened to American aircraft near Soviet territory in the years before November 1952. They did not come back. Not one of them. Not once. And every one of those aircraft was a lumbering patrol plane or a reconnaissance aircraft, unarmed or barely armed, flying alone. None of them was a fighter. None of them fought back. The Soviet Air Defense Force in the Far East had, at that point, an unbroken record against the United States, and it had achieved it without meaningful resistance. That is the machine that was about to be pointed at Royce Williams, and the man who was going to point it had, from his own perspective, extremely good reasons. Because in the middle of November 1952, the United States Navy sailed 3 fleet carriers to within about 80 nautical miles of Vladivostok. Vladivostok was not a target. Vladivostok was the point. It was the headquarters of Soviet naval power in the Pacific, a fortress city, a base, an arsenal, and the anchor of the entire Soviet position in the Far East. And an American carrier task force had just parked itself off the coast, closer than it had ever come, inside a blizzard, launching aircraft. The Americans were there for a reason that had nothing to do with the Soviet Union. The armistice talks at Panmunjom had ground into a bitter deadlock, and General Mark Clark had approved a maximum effort against North Korean industrial and logistics targets in the far northeast of the country, at Hyeryong and Chongjin and Kilchu. Hit the enemy hard enough in his sanctuaries, and perhaps he becomes reasonable at the table. Those targets sat right up against the Soviet border. To reach them from the sea, the carriers had to come north. So north they came. Now look at that same picture from an air defense headquarters near Vladivostok. You cannot see through the storm. You have radar, and radar tells you that 3 American aircraft carriers are 80 nautical miles from the most important naval base you possess, and that they are launching aircraft into weather, and you do not know where those aircraft are going. You know the Americans have been flying reconnaissance aircraft along your coast for 2 years, because you have been shooting them down. You know that a carrier air group that can strike Hyeryong can strike you. You do not know that the Americans have no intention of attacking Soviet soil. You cannot know that. You only know what your radar tells you, and what your radar tells you is that the threat is 80 miles away and moving. So you scramble. Early that afternoon, 7 MiG-15s lifted off from Unashi airfield near Vladivostok, in 2 groups, one of 4 and one of 3. They belonged to the 781st Fighter Aviation Regiment. They were under the control of a Soviet ground intercept controller, and their orders were explicit. Find the American aircraft near the carriers and attack them. There is a small, strange coincidence buried in that. The Soviet unit was the 781st. Royce Williams's squadron was Fighter Squadron 781, 2 formations with the same number, about to kill each other over the same water. The Americans saw them coming. The carrier's radar picked up the contacts to the north, and 4 Panthers of Fighter Squadron 781 were launched into the snow to intercept. The division was led by Lieutenant Claire Elwood, with Lieutenant Junior Grade John Middleton on his wing. Williams led the 2nd section, with Lieutenant Junior Grade David Rowlands on his. These 4 men had never flown together as a unit before that day. They were what was available. They climbed up through the overcast and broke out somewhere above 12,000 feet into that hard, clean blue that sits on top of every storm, and all 4 of them saw it at once. 7 contrails, far above, drawing white lines across the top of the sky. And then Claire Elwood's fuel pump warning light came on. There is nothing dramatic about a warning light. It is a small piece of colored glass. But an aircraft with a failing fuel pump, at altitude, in weather, over water that kills you in 10 minutes, is an aircraft that is minutes away from being a tragedy. Elwood was ordered to return to the carrier and orbit overhead. Middleton, his wingman, went with him, because that is what a wingman does. The 4 Panthers had just become 2 straight-wing American fighters, 7 swept-wing Soviet fighters, and the Soviets were sitting 20,000 feet above them. In air combat, height is stored speed. The men above choose the moment. The men below only get to react to it. Williams and Rowlands kept climbing, and as they climbed, the MiGs came down out of contrail altitude, and Williams lost sight of them, and for a moment, there was nothing in the sky at all. Then they were there. 4 MiGs came at them in an echelon from the right, already firing. 3 more came in from the left. There was no warning and no maneuvering room, and no time to think about any of it. Williams turned into them. That is the entire tactical foundation of everything that follows, and it is worth stopping on, because it is the only correct answer to an impossible problem. A slower aircraft cannot run. If Williams had tried to dive away, the MiGs would have caught him in the dive and shot him in the back. If he had tried to climb, they would have outclimbed him 2-1 and shot him in the back. If he had steadied up for even a few seconds to line up a careful shot on one MiG, the other 5 would have killed him while he did it. He had exactly one move: turn. Turn continuously, at level altitude, in the tightest circle a Panther could fly, and never stop turning, and take a snapshot at any MiG that happened to cross his gun sight, and never, ever present a stable target. On that first pass, he hit the trailing MiG. It fell out of the fight, damaged. And then his wingman left. Rowlands went down after the damaged MiG to finish it. It is what a young pilot does. It is almost an instinct. And it is worth saying that Rowlands's guns had not fired at all that day, and would not fire at all that day, which means he chased a wounded enemy aircraft down through a snowstorm with nothing to shoot it with. Royce Williams was now alone. 1 Panther, 6 MiG-15s. The United States Navy's own account describes what followed as the longest dogfight in the history of naval aviation, roughly 35 minutes. Some historians, working the Soviet fuel numbers, argue the actual shooting was shorter, perhaps 8 to 15 minutes, with the rest of that half-hour consumed by the fight for survival and the journey home. I am telling you that disagreement exists because you deserve to know where the record is solid and where it is argued. What is not argued is what he did. He turned, and he kept turning. He held the throttle wide open and flew tight, level, punishing circles, and the MiGs came at him in relays. They had the speed to break off, climb, reposition, and come back at him whenever they liked. And they did, again and again and again. 6 aircraft, each one faster than his, each one able to leave and return at will, and one man in the middle, turning and turning and turning. He described his method afterward without a shred of drama. He used what he called fire discipline. With 760 rounds he could not spray. He fired when a MiG crossed his sight, and he did not fire when one did not. He fired until every round was gone. By the time his guns went empty, Royce Williams had hit at least 2 more MiGs, and probably a third. And then the 37mm round found him. It struck his wing root, where the wing meets the fuselage, and it blew a hole in his aircraft, and threw shrapnel through the airframe in more than 250 places. His plane captain would later go over that Panther with a grease pencil, marking each hole so he could count them, and arrive at 263. A few inches in either direction and it would have killed him. The hit destroyed his hydraulics. With the hydraulics went the rudder. With the rudder went the flaps. His ailerons went to partial control at best. What he had left was an elevator and a throttle. And a MiG behind him. He dove for the cloud deck, because cloud is the only cover there is at 20,000 feet, and the Soviet pilot came after him, firing. Williams could not turn. He could not maneuver in any way that the word maneuver normally means. What he could do was pull the nose up and push it down. So he did that. He porpoised. He rode his one surviving control surface in a bucking, lurching, up and down oscillation all the way down toward the clouds, refusing to hold still, spoiling the aim of the man trying to kill him, with Tracer going past the canopy. Then Rowlands came back. He rejoined the fight and drove the Soviet pilot off, and he did it, again, without a working gun. He simply put his aircraft where an aircraft should not have been, and made the MiG break away. And John Middleton came back too. He had escorted Elwood home, and then he had climbed back into the fight, and he shot down a MiG, most likely one that Williams had already savaged, because the aircraft was smoking and barely maneuvering, and its pilot ejected almost immediately. Williams fell into the cloud and came out the bottom of it at around 400 feet above the Sea of Japan. He could not eject. A Panther's ejection seat needed altitude he did not have, and below him was that water and the 10 minutes it would give him. So he flew. With an elevator and a throttle, he flew a butchered aircraft toward a carrier he could not see. The airplane would not fly slowly. Without hydraulics, without flaps, It became uncontrollable, below about 170 knots. A Panther lands at around 105 knots. Williams was going to have to put his aircraft onto a snow-covered, heaving flight deck at 65 knots above normal landing speed, with no rudder to correct his lineup. And then his own destroyers shot at him. They were escorts. They were on alert. A damaged aircraft came at them out of a snow squall from the direction of Vladivostok, and they opened fire. They missed. It is one of those small, ugly, entirely human details that gets sanded away when this story is told as a legend, and I think it belongs in it. The Oriskany turned the whole ship to give him a straight-in approach, because a man without a rudder cannot make a turning correction on final. He came down the groove far too fast, on a deck moving through 20 feet of arc, in falling snow. He caught the 3-wire, a near-perfect landing. He was not injured, not a scratch. And I want to correct something here that almost every retelling of this story gets wrong, because I would rather be accurate than dramatic. You will very often hear that the Panther was so badly damaged that it was stripped and pushed over the side into the sea. The Naval History and Heritage Command has looked at this specifically and says it did not happen. The aircraft was repaired. It went back into service. Which means that somewhere in the United States Navy in 1953, there were pilots flying an airplane with 263 patched holes in it, and almost none of them knew what it had done. Now let us talk about the men who knew. Aboard the heavy cruiser Helena, sailing with that task force, there was a small detachment of men doing work that almost nobody in the fleet was aware of. They were radio intelligence specialists. They were listening to Soviet military communications. The National Security Agency had been formally established 2 weeks earlier, on November 4, 1952. This engagement has been described as the first operation of its kind conducted under that new authority, carried out by Naval Security Group personnel wearing a very new hat. That team heard the MiGs launch from Unashi. That team listened to the Soviet ground controller vectoring them. That team heard Soviet pilots talking to each other while Royce Williams was turning in circles trying not to die. And that team knew, in real time, that Soviet aircraft were going into the water. So when Williams climbed down from his shredded Panther, there were already Americans in that task force who knew exactly what he had done and who understood immediately that it was a disaster. Not a military disaster, a political one. Follow the logic the way those men had to. An American naval aviator had just killed Soviet military pilots in combat over international water. There was no fig leaf available, no Chinese markings, no volunteers, no plausible deniability of any kind. These were Soviet aircraft from a Soviet base under Soviet control, and an American had shot 4 of them down, and the Soviet ground controller had heard his own pilots die. Now think about the calendar. It was November 1952. Joseph Stalin was alive, and would be for another 4 months. The Soviet Union had possessed a nuclear weapon for 3 years, and the United States had, functionally, no government. Harry Truman was a lame duck who had already lost the election. Dwight Eisenhower had won it 2 weeks earlier and would not be inaugurated until January. For 10 weeks, the most powerful country on earth was between drivers. Put a headline into that gap. American pilot downs 4 Soviet fighters. What happens next? The American public demands to know what Soviet fighters were doing attacking American aircraft. The Soviet government, humiliated, is forced to respond. Both sides climb a ladder neither wants to climb, and the man responsible for the American side of it is a president with 10 weeks left in office and no mandate to fight a war. There was a second problem, and in the long run it may have been the larger one. If the United States announced that it knew the pilots were Soviet, the obvious next question was how it knew. And the answer was that the United States was reading Soviet communications. That capability was worth incomparably more than 4 aircraft. Revealing it to win a news cycle would have been one of the worst trades in the history of intelligence. So the American government made a decision. The fight could be reported. The enemy could not be named. About a week later, in Yokosuka, Japan, Lieutenant Royce Williams was summoned to see Vice Admiral Robert Briscoe, commander of United States naval forces in the Far East. It was a private meeting. One admiral, one lieutenant, one closed door. Say nothing. Not to reporters, not to your squadron, not to your commanding officer, not to the captain of your ship, not to your wife. In December, President-elect Eisenhower came to Korea, keeping a campaign promise. Williams was brought to see him. By Williams's own account, Eisenhower greeted him warmly and introduced him to Generals Bradley, Clark, and Ridgway, and the men in that room explained to him, again, how important it was that nobody ever know he had fought the Russians. Sit with that for a second. The incoming President of the United States, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the theater commander, in the middle of a war, taking the time to personally impress upon a 27-year-old lieutenant that the largest thing he would ever do had to stay in a box. And then the record was written to match. In 1953, Royce Williams received the Silver Star. It is a serious decoration. In the Navy's order of precedence, it sits third, below the Medal of Honor and below the Navy Cross. The citation credited him with 1 enemy aircraft destroyed and 1 damaged. It did not say the aircraft were Soviet. It did not say there had been 7 of them. It did not say 4 went into the sea. The Naval History and Heritage Command has since said something quietly devastating about that citation. It says the citation is historically inaccurate, and explains why. The men who wrote it did not have the top-secret radio intelligence. They did not have the Russian side of the story. They wrote what they were permitted to know. And so, instead of being recognized as the most successful carrier-based jet fighter pilot of the entire Korean War, Royce Williams became one of 221 Navy personnel to receive a Silver Star in that conflict, a number in a list. He went back to work. He flew Sabres and Super Sabres out of Nellis Air Force Base in the middle 1950s, the swept-wing aircraft that would have made his life so much easier 3 years earlier. He commanded a fighter squadron. He survived a crash in 1957 that hurt his back and his neck. And from December 1965 to January 1967, more than a decade after the Sea of Japan, he flew 110 combat missions over Vietnam as the commanding officer of Carrier Air Wing 11, from the deck of the carrier Kitty Hawk. Later, the Navy made him Director of Prisoner of War and Missing in Action Matters. He supervised the repatriation of American servicemen, including the crew of the Pueblo. There is a bleak symmetry in that appointment that I doubt anybody intended. A man forbidden to tell his own story spent years of his life recovering men whose stories nobody knew. He commanded a ship. He retired as a captain in January 1980 after roughly 37 years and 3 wars, with around 4,500 flight hours and 518 carrier landings. And through every year of it, he said nothing, not to his wife. That is not a rhetorical flourish. For decades, the woman he was married to did not know what her husband had done on November 18, 1952. Now let us do the accounting, honestly, because a story like this either survives contact with the archives or it does not, and I would rather hand you the truth than hand you a legend. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. The archives opened, Russian historians began publishing, and the other side of that afternoon slowly came into focus. Russian sources name the pilots: Captain Belyakov, who led, Senior Lieutenant Vandayev, Senior Lieutenant Pakomkin, Senior Lieutenant Pushkarev. Belyakov, Vandayev, and Pakomkin were killed. Pushkarev flew home. He was the only one of them who did. He survived Royce Williams, and then he was killed in action over Korea on June 5, 1953, 7 weeks before the armistice ended the war. The Naval History and Heritage Command's assessment, published in November 2022 after its director spoke with Williams directly, is that at least 4 and possibly 5 Soviet pilots died in that engagement, at least 3 during the fight itself, and at least 1 more while trying to nurse a damaged aircraft home. It notes, pointedly, that Russian sources are not in the habit of exaggerating their own losses. So here is where the evidence actually stands, stated plainly. Royce Williams is credited with 4. Multiple MiGs were hit by his guns and confirmed lost. At least one Soviet pilot died trying to get a wounded aircraft back to base. And whether that counts as a kill depends on what you think a kill is. One of the Soviet aircraft, Potemkins, was reportedly recovered later from shallow water near the coast, in a condition that some accounts describe as showing no obvious battle damage, which might mean engine failure, or a fuel tank leaking from a hit he took in the fight, or something else entirely. We do not know and probably never will. And there is one more honest caveat, and it is a real one. American radar and American pilots reported 7 MiGs, and the Naval History and Heritage Command's own account says 7, launched in 2 divisions. But some historians working from Russian records argue that only 4 Soviet aircraft can be documented as airborne from the 781st that day, and that no corroborating evidence exists for the other 3. Others point out that the Soviet air defense system around Vladivostok, on a day when 3 American carriers were sitting 80 miles offshore, would not have responded with a single small flight, and that aircraft from other units are entirely plausible. I cannot close that gap for you, and I will not pretend to. What no one disputes is this: Royce Williams, alone, in an obsolete straight-wing fighter, against multiple Soviet swept-wing fighters, over water that would have killed him in minutes, expended every round he carried, destroyed several of them, took a 37mm shell in the wing root, and brought the aircraft home. There is one final piece of the accounting, and it is the cruelest one. For decades, the Navy's own historians would not revise his credit. Their reasoning was not malice, it was procedure. There was no surviving American witness to most of the fight. Rowlands had spent the crucial minutes chasing a damaged MiG through cloud. Elwood was gone, Middleton was gone and came back only at the end. The only man who saw those minutes was the man asking for the credit. The Navy's record keepers, in other words, were trapped by a secret the Navy itself had imposed. The evidence that would have vindicated Royce Williams was the evidence the United States government had classified to protect itself. The door was finally opened from the other side. It was the Russians who told the truth first. Their names, their losses, their archives, published in the 1990s. American-Korean War records followed around 2002. 50 years after the fact, Royce Williams was informed that he could speak. The first person he told was his wife. He did not go on tour. He did not write a memoir. The story moved slowly, through aviation circles, among people who understood what it meant, until in November 2017, a magazine article finally told it to a national audience. And then other people went to war on his behalf. A retired Rear Admiral named Doniphan Shelton began campaigning for the Medal of Honor in 2014. Shelton died in 2021 at the age of 100, without seeing it happen. Veterans organizations passed resolutions. A congressman from California, Darrell Issa, took up the case and called it the most unique American and Soviet aerial combat dogfight in the history of the Cold War. In July 2022, the House of Representatives voted to waive the statute of limitations standing in the way. The Senate stripped the provision out in conference. Then, in December 2022, the Secretary of the Navy, Carlos del Toro, approved an upgrade. On January 2023, at the San Diego Air and Space Museum, Royce Williams was awarded the Navy Cross. It sits one step below the Medal of Honor and no further. Del Toro said he had reviewed the findings of numerous investigations and had determined the case to be special and extraordinary. Williams was 97 years old. And that is where most people stop telling this story. An old man, a late medal, a good afternoon in San Diego. It is not where it stops. The legal obstacle had always been the same, a statute of limitations that effectively barred the Medal of Honor for actions this old. So legislation was written to remove it, specifically for him, and the authorization was carried in the annual defense bill. On February 4, 2026, Congressman Issa announced that the president had personally told Williams the medal was coming. On February 24, 2026, in the chamber of the House of Representatives, during the State of the Union address, the First Lady of the United States placed the Medal of Honor around the neck of Elmer Royce Williams. It was the first time in American history that the Medal of Honor had been presented during a State of the Union. He was inducted into the Pentagon's Hall of Heroes the following day. He was 100 years old. He turned 101 this past April. He is the last living Medal of Honor recipient of the Korean War. 73 years and 3 months separated the afternoon he fought the Soviet Air Defense Force over the Sea of Japan from the evening his country finally stood up in front of the assembled Congress and said so out loud. So what is this story actually about? I do not think it is a story about a hero, although he was one. I think it is a story about the machinery that swallowed him, and that machinery is still running. The Cold War was not primarily a contest of battles. It was a contest of stories, and both superpowers grasped that certain facts, if spoken, would compel actions that neither government wanted to take. So those facts went unspoken. Soviet pilots in Korean skies did not exist. 4 MiGs in the Sea of Japan did not exist. Belyakov, Vandayev, and Pakhomkin were buried by a country that could not say where they had been. And the uncomfortable part, the part I keep turning over, is that the silence may have been correct. If Royce Williams's fight had run on the front page in December 1952, with Stalin alive and an American administration packing its boxes, it is not at all obvious that the world would have been better for it. The men who told him to keep quiet may have been right. They were also, without question, protecting their own programs and their own careers. Both of those things are true simultaneously. That is usually how it works. And the impulse did not die with the Soviet Union. American and Russian aircraft still meet in this part of the world, constantly. In July 2024, North American Aerospace Defense Command intercepted Russian and Chinese bombers flying together inside the Alaska Air Defense Identification Zone, the first time those two air forces had ever conducted a joint bomber flight near American territory. Russian aircraft are intercepted near Alaska routinely. Russian and Chinese aircraft press against Japanese airspace. The Sea of Japan, the same water, remains one of the most heavily watched and militarily crowded bodies of water on the planet. And every single one of those encounters is managed. The language chosen for the public statements is deliberately, almost aggressively boring, routine, professional, not considered a threat. The wording exists to lower the temperature, to give everyone an exit, to keep an incident from becoming an event. That is the same instinct that put a 27-year-old lieutenant in a room with an admiral in Yokosuka. The aircraft have changed completely. The impulse has not changed at all. Which brings us back to where we started, and to the thing that has been sitting underneath this whole story. We say the 4 MiGs were a secret for 50 years. That is true, and it is also the wrong way to look at it. The MiGs were not the secret. The MiGs were the consequence. The secret was that the United States and the Soviet Union had been shooting at each other for 2 years already, that their pilots had been killing each other by the hundreds, and that both governments were flatly denying it to their own people. Royce Williams did not create that secret. He simply won too well, too completely, and in the wrong place. Over open water, against aircraft from a Soviet base, in front of an American listening post that heard every second of it. He left no room for the lie. He was not silenced for failing. He was silenced for succeeding somewhere the story could not absorb it. And he said, "Yes, sir." He went back to the flight line and stayed in uniform for another 28 years and led men into a different war and brought prisoners home from a third, and never once broke his word to a government that had taken the largest thing in his life and locked it in a safe. When it was finally over and he could finally speak, he did not make himself the point of it. Ask why it had all stayed buried for half a century, he gave an answer with no heroism in it whatsoever. Russia did not want it known, he said, and America did not want it known. Nobody wanted a third world war. That is the entire Cold War, in one sentence, from a man who had earned the right to say something a great deal grander and chose not to. The MiGs are still down there, somewhere under that cold grey water. Belyakov and Vandayev and Pakhomkin are still in them, in aircraft their own country could not admit it had sent. Pushkarev, the one who flew home, was dead within 7 months anyway, in a war that ended before the summer was out. And Royce Williams is in Escondido, California, 101 years old, wearing a medal that took his country 73 years to give him. For 35 minutes it spent 50 of those years refusing to name.